go as is, and everybody can introduce themselves at lunchtime or something like that, so we can get through this meeting. So first thing I'll mention, the lake is low. So
Thank you.
So I just wanted to update people on that. Low
Can we
lake,
adjourn now? We know that.
yeah.
That takes care of our presentation. Thanks, John.
I kind of thought I wanted to
Stole
steal
your
your
thunder,
thunder.
did he? Sure did.
And then Ashley is recording this meeting, so just so y'all know, it's being recorded, and we'll provide that. I think John sent the tag notes from the last meeting, so if you had any changes or things that you wanted to options that you want to change there, just let him know so we can upgrade or update that. And then before we get started with the presentation from USGS, I was going to let everybody, well, first, Phil, you can come sit up at the table. We're going to add you to the technical advisory as a representative for the industry. So hopefully you don't hold off on voicing your opinion.
It comes with a big pay
Oh,
increase.
he doesn't want to sit next
He
to
doesn't
us.
want to sit next
Yeah,
to
we're-
you,
That's
Gary.
okay. That's
No,
okay.
no, go ahead.
So you get triple the amount that you were getting paid
You know what I
before.
mean?
So,
Gary, you're.
so we'll go ahead and get started. And Ryan, I'll let you and Christine go over your stuff. And I think I kind of mentioned a little bit of a summary of, because there's a few new folks both online and here that can kind of catch us up from what we've been doing over the years, and then kind of break into what we're going to be doing.
Yeah, we can talk about that. All right, well, it's a pleasure to be here as always. So, we have a pretty large team at the USGS working on Great Salt Lake. We have Christine Rumsey and Hannah McIlwain are here today to help show you this information. Next slide, please. We'll talk about lake elevations, inflow, discharge information, and then we'll talk about water quality, nutrients, and salinity on the lake. These are kind of our usual points of attack. And just for context, the contract we have with Division of Wildlife Resources is to run a stream gauge at Goggin Drain to make periodic discharge measurements at the Bear River Bay outflow. It's monthly nutrient samples collected from 4 sites out on the lake. John's group collects those samples, and then we take them and send them to our lab. And also then we do nutrient monitoring at 4 main surface water inflow gauges. So that covers the bulk of the contract that we have with John. There's a smaller task 3 this year that includes a little bit of additional funding to help with the reporting on the nutrient mass flux work that Christine and others started a year and a half ago or so. And there's a little bit of money in there to do some more monitoring for suspended sediment loads in the lake. So that's our contract for the FY 2023 in a nutshell. Okay, next slide. Let's just talk about Great Salt Lake elevations really quick. So 4189.6 on August 15th, we're in record low territory, and we're down about 1.5 feet from last year. So we have data on the plot showing from October 2019 to basically the current period. And it's average daily lake elevation relative to the 1929 data. And so over the last 3 years, we're all familiar with this precipitous drop off. This year is looking a lot like last year in terms of how lake elevations are behaving during this dry time of the year. And if you hit the next button, we'll do a little close up on data just going out to July of this year to the current period. The yellow line is data for this year. The purple line is
Sorry,
that's
I'm
okay.
having issues online.
It's okay. The purple line is data from a year ago overlaid on the same plot. And
about that.
These are instantaneous values that are measured every 15 minutes on this plot that has popped up. And so the data are a little more noisy, but the slope of those lines, I think to my eye, are pretty similar. We're behaving pretty similar to the way we were last year in terms of lake level drop. Next slide. Here's the same information for our gauge on the north arm of the lake. This is near Saline, Utah. Data from October 2019 to present. So as of the 15th of October or August, we were at 4189.4. We're down about 1.2 feet from a year ago. The historic low at this site is 4189.0, and that was in September 2016. That was kind of because the north arm was cut off, right, through the culverts being closed and the new breach was being constructed. So we're approaching that new historic low, or that historic low from 2016. I'm not planning on doing a press release for that. I think I'm just going to confuse the messaging out there. We'll just let this one happen. We're going to break that record most likely. We'll see how it goes though. And then here again, I'm showing data just for the July to the present period. The yellow line is this year, the purple line is the previous year, overlaid on the same plot. And those slopes look pretty similar to me. Now for major surface water inflows, I like how Ashley's keeping me paid. She's keeping me going. She's hitting the next button. Cumulative stream flow in millions of acre feet on the y-axis, it's a log scale, and then a water year shown on the x-axis. The bold black line is the current water year, 2022. The blue is the highest ever measured cumulative flow. Sorry guys, I'm blocking your view. The yellowish orange line is the lowest ever measured. That was 1992 for the Bear River near Corinne. This is our gauge on the largest surface water inflow to the lake, right? So the green shaded area is the normal range. It's the 75th, 25th percentile. On the little gray line in the middle of the green shaded area is the 50th percentile. We're well below the green shaded area here. So we're not having a great water year in terms of this gauge. If we hit the next button, here's the Weber River near Plain City, Utah. It's the exact same type of plot. We're doing not very well at this gauge. I can tell you the Bear River, the previous plot, we're doing slightly better relative to last year. This gauge, we're doing slightly worse relative to last year.
Sorry, people can't see. I can't like watch the chat and present, and I guess people can't see. Hold on. Might have to keep it like in this view. I can't.
I mean, I think we can get through it.
Okay.
With this view. I have plots showing the Weber River. We just looked at that. Well below normal. And then Goggin Drain, that happens to be on top right now. So the bold black line for Goggin Drain is very close to that 25th percentile, slightly less. So these are low flows. And then, so here's the Bear River Crane. Hit the next button.
What?
Treating that as a second monitor as opposed to mirror in the same.
Okay.
So you may need to actually go to your settings and.
This is why you go into the restaurant, not through the drive-through.
What about now?
The online stuff is the drive-through.
This is still.
You get all your stuff spit.
Okay, so what about now?
Much better.
Okay, I can't see the chat, so
Yeah, this works better.
okay.
Okay, just hit the next button. So here's Weaver. There's this is Farmington Bay outflow.
You wanted this one or?
Let's go back to Farmington Bay right there.
Okay.
Farmington Bay outflow. We're below that green range. Okay, so we're not having a great year at this site. The slope on that most recent data is pretty flat. And if you've been watching the flows online for this site, you know they went down very low, just almost to just above zero. We've had better inflows in response to the monsoon, But overall, we're not having a great year at this site. Next. And then we talked about Gog and Drain already. If you sum up all the water that's passed all 4 gauges for water year 2022, so all the water that's passed the gauges up to August 15th, you get 738,000 acre feet. So I just rounded a little bit. If you compare it to that same time last year, 658,000 acre feet. So we're up almost 80,000 acre feet overall relative to last year, if we assume that everything that's passing that Corinne gauge makes it to the south arm of Great Salt Lake. But overall, a slight improvement. Now, don't get too excited. 738,000, keep that number in mind. Next slide. Let's just keep that number in mind as we look at this plot. This is showing the average inflow in acre feet for all 4 of those gauges we just looked at over time. So we got data going back to 2008 to 2021. And if we look at the average annual flows for all 4 of those gauges and we add them up for their individual periods of record, some of the gauges have a longer period of record than others. But if you just add those up, it's almost 2 million acre feet on average passing those gauges. So let's just go to the far right and look at 2021. The blue area is the Bear River Corinne. The green area is the Weaver River. The whatever the color that is, slightly yellow, is Farmington Bay. And the light blue is Gog and Drain. And the very top of that line is like 700,000 acre feet. So somewhere in there, I'm just ballparking, way, way, way below that 2 million. We have, 2021 was a disaster in terms of just flows through all of our streams and rivers in the state of Utah. It was a terrible drought. Okay, so we're in mid-August. We have a little ways, a month and a half to finish out the water year, and we just saw we're at what 750 plus thousand acre feet. I don't think we're gonna have a very good year this year in terms of we're gonna be plotting down in this zone here, well below this 2 million acre feet average. Here is a table of periodic discharge measurements that we make at the Bear River outflow bridge on the causeway. So we don't run a gauge there. We only do periodic discharge measurements at this site. And our goal is to get 8 to 10 of these done a year. We have about 7. We have 7 done so far this year. The flows, you can see the wide range on here. We have 1,300, 1,600 CFS down to nothing. Typically, these last few years, warm summer periods, not much flow there, not enough for us to even measure. We need to start entering zeros every time we make an observation of no flow at that site. We have been consistent about that in the past. But if you hit the next button, we'll look at a plot. See, all plots are always better than tables. So here's discharge in cubic feet per second. The dark blue line is the average daily flow measured at the Corinne gauge. The red squares are these discrete discharge measurements made at the Bear River Bay Bridge outflow. Overall, the red, the discrete measurements, generally follow the trends of the information at Bear River Corinne. The correlation is not fantastic. This is a problem. I think everyone in this room knows it's a problem, and it's one we need to attack. We're thinking, because the lake is so low and it's not going to shoot back up, we're thinking the upper bridge, the bridge at, what is it called? Mineral Bridge.
Right next to the trapezoid.
Yeah.
Or what I call the trapezoid.
Yeah, it's the upstream bridge from the railroad causeway. Right now, things are acting like a river there. Water's not backing up due to having Bear River Bay full. So we're not having weird impacts on water velocities due to backwater. We think we can put in some down-looking water velocity sensors that measure the velocity of the surface water passing under that bridge. We can do measurements of the cross-sectional area and actually get some decent gauge data at this site. We've already purchased the equipment to do that. That was a lot of money. Thanks to some of the saline lakes legislation you're hearing about in the news. So we're going to be shopping this idea around. We're looking for partners to help us get there. And I'm thinking of Fish and Wildlife Service because of the Bear Bird Refuge and maybe a state partner or two. But we'll talk more about that, I think, as time goes on. Next, one other remark on the discharge measurements made at the Causeway Bridge. So that's where we collect our nutrient samples for nutrient mass balance work that Christine is going to talk about. And we want to collect those nutrient samples as close to the lake as possible because it's all about a mass balance in the main body of the lake. We don't want to be collecting nutrient samples at the Corinne gauge, and we're not, you know, we'll see how things play out. Not sure if the mineral bridge, it will be appropriate because nutrients are so reactive in the system. We want to keep collecting them as close to the lake as we can. So just in case you're wondering, well, why not just, you know, do everything in the Corinne gauge or whatever? When it comes to nutrients, we want to be as close to the lake as possible. And anytime we collect a water quality sample, we collect a discharge value as well. Next slide. Okay, we're doing a lot of monitoring at the new breach, including some nutrient sampling that this group, that John's group is funding. But there's lots of other things going on there. So we have our monthly discharge measurements that we make with, you know, like we do at the Bear River outflow. Then we have lake elevation gauges just off the causeway measuring north side elevation, south side elevations. We have weather sensors. We have an uplooker velocity meter measuring velocity vectors through the water column. And we're coordinating this group with USU, who's working on the flow model. So there's interesting things that have been happening, right, at the new breach recently. So we're going to get into a little bit of that. So here is a plot of our complete record of discrete discharge measurements made at the new breach. So those measurements start back in 2016. Blue are south to north flows. Reds are north to south flows. The light gray line is the elevation difference between you know, we had much higher flows obviously when the new breach opened, and the south arm was 3 feet or so higher than the north arm. So lots of south arm water moving. And through time, we see the light gray line. Let's just look at the more recent data. The elevation differences have been going down. And the most recent data, which you probably can't see very well, the elevation difference between the south and the north arms is down to about 0.1 or 0.2 feet. Historically, it's about 0.5, 0.4 feet. Although there were periods, short-lived periods in this data set where it was quite low as well. But now it's quite low, okay? 0.2, 0.1 foot of head difference. And you see how the blue circles have dropped to much lower values. So the south to north flows have dropped. And then the red circles, I mean, the most recent red or north to south discharge value plotted here is 11 CFS, and that's an estimated value that was measured after the berm was raised. There's a lot of error associated with that. That's why we say estimated. But, you know, historically, we're in the hundreds of CFS and even higher for north to south. After the berm was raised, we're down to 11 or less. And then these south to north of the blues have dropped off significantly recently as well. And we're down around, I think it's 250, in the 200 to 300 CFS range most recently. If you hit the next button, I should have done this earlier, but let's zoom in. So now we're showing just data from September of 2020 out to some of the most recent data values we've collected. And you can see discharge on the y-axis, elevation difference on the second y-axis. And you can really get a sense of what I'm talking about. The berm was raised, I mean, literally, like right here, you know, right when this really low red value appears here, these lower blue values, this is when the berm was raised up. So flows in both directions at the new breach have slowed down. And here's data, velocity data from our uplooker AECP. So that's measuring velocity vectors at 10 locations in the water column at the new breach. So it's an uplooker. And on the y-axis, we have velocity in feet per second. You can see the zero value, positive values. So the values above zero are south to north velocities. Negative values are north to south velocities. The berm was raised right where you see these north velocities just converge towards zero. That's when they actually raised the berm. So there was an immediate response. to raising the berm at the new breach. The velocities from north to south trended to very, very low values, near zero. And so we can see what's happened through time since then. We see events where the negative velocities turn up. They're infrequent, out to about August 5th. Maybe wind events. I didn't plot wind up against this. I haven't done that yet. But more recently, there's a lot more noise here, where we see more negative velocities. So water moving from north to south. And we need to take a closer look at this to see what's going on. This could be due to events, and since we don't have big elevation differences between the north and the south, maybe we don't need as big wind events to cause some flow reversals. But this is the kind of information that SOM at USU, the modelers, are going to really be chewing on to help them refine their flow model for the new breach. But the nice news is we're building a really good data set to understand what's happening there. Any questions? That's it for me. I'm going to step down, so I'm happy to take questions on anything I've shown. Okay.
That seems a lot noisier there just more recently than we would expect than just wind events.
Yeah. And I think it might have something to do with these elevation differences being much, much less. And so tipping the scales one way or the other is just easier to do. So we'll have to see. We're making more frequent visits to do manual measurements at this site to validate this information. So any questions online?
So Lynn has just a comment. She says that maybe if the GSL basin study is funded with BOR support, some money for these additional gauges could be funded as well.
Yeah, exactly. And we're on the lookout for that for sure.
What's the last? Oh, go ahead. I was just wondering if we're looking at the geometry of the berm since it's being raised. I mean, could it be that there's a deterioration of that?
Yeah, so we are going to be doing the bathymetric, I'm going to call it bathymetric surveys of the channel and the berm. We haven't done any since the berm was raised, but that is in the monitoring plan. That is something we're going to be doing a couple times a year. So yeah, that'll be interesting to track.
I mean, I just think this data shows how important it is that we're doing this.
Yeah,
great data.
And it's a good point. Maybe something's happened. Some of the berm has been knocked away for big wave action. That's a good point.
When's the last time you were able to measure Bear River at the causeway?
Our last measurement in the database was May something, and we know there have been flows since then.
Oh,
There has been. The monsoons contributed flows, and recently, the last week or two, those who are watching this information, flows of the Bear River Corinne gauge jumped to 1,000 CFS from just like 100 CFS up to 1,000. We weren't able to get out there. We were probably at this site, so we missed getting a manual measurement.
Yeah, that's the first. So probably a week, or I can't remember when we were flying, that it was the first time we've seen it connect since spring.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's been zero flow the whole summer up until what, a week ago? What was it?
Yeah. All right. Anything else? All right, I'll turn it over to Christine.
Great.
Thank you.
Cool. So I'll jump into talking about the water quality monitoring we do in partnership with the Great Salt Lake System program. So we'll start with the inflow monitoring. We monitor 6 of the major inflows to Great Salt Lake, including Bear River at Bear River Bay, Beaver River at Plain City, Farmington Bay at the Causeway Bridge, and Goggin Drain, as well as monitoring our openings in the Causeway. And next slide, we can go to what we've done thus far. In water year 2022, which for us starts on October 21st, we've conducted 7 sample rounds at all of these sites. Our goal is usually 8 to 9, so we're right on target to hit that. We're going to collect 1 more in September, so we're collecting the samples that we set out to do. Next. For the open water sampling, this is done in partnership with GSLEP. They go out every month and collect water quality samples at 2 depths at each of these 4 sites. And we're measuring nutrients and salinity just like we are at the inflows. Next slide shows what we've collected thus far. eight sample rounds at these 4 sites, at shallow and deep, except for at 2767, which is right at the kind of the mouth of Farmington Bay. That site has become so shallow, it's really not worth it to get a deep sample anymore. The last sample that we were able to collect was at the end of June, and we just can't access the lake point. So we're limited by accessibility. Kyle knows most about that. So we're hoping we can get a sample and other samples. And then these plots just kind of illustrate the kind of data that we're collecting and the record that we're building. The top plot is total dissolved phosphorus, the bottom is total dissolved nitrogen. We also measure the speciation of each of those phosphorus and nitrogen constituents. We kind of break the record into these shallow and deep samples. Deep samples are the solid round circles, and then shallow samples are shown as the triangles. And from this record, what jumps out immediately is the effect of the deep brine layer, which is indicated by this gray shaded time period. It's where we see a jump in both total dissolved phosphorus and total dissolved nitrogen at depth when the deep brine layer is present, really giving us clues that that is a characteristic that's affecting geochemical cycling and of nutrients in the lake and probably bioavailability of nutrients to the ecosystem. If we click one more time, Ashley, I just wanted to kind of illustrate how these shallow total dissolved nitrogen concentrations have kind of shifted over time, possibly in relation to different hydroclimatic conditions or management paradigms. So prior to 2014, kind of this period, 2010 to 2014, we're measuring about 3.8 milligrams per liter. This is the time period that was dominated by those big culverts in the causeway. That's how North and South Arm were connected. When they closed and we had a period of no deep brine layer, no connectivity between North and South, or very limited, we saw the shallow total dissolved nitrogen concentrations jump up to 4.8, probably as a result of kind of mixing between the deep brine and these upper brine layers. And then again, from the most recent period after the new breach has opened, we're seeing the concentrations in the shallow water decrease again to about 4.3. Just kind of illustrating a big picture that, you know, different management paradigms, how water is moving through the causeway may be affecting kind of the concentrations of total dissolved nitrogen in the upper brine, where the biologically active zones find shrimp and algae. And to click one more time, I just wanted to illustrate the ammonia data set we have. This is from about 2016 to present. And again, ammonia is very heavily influenced by the deep brine layer, where we see when it's present at depth, our samples, our ammonia concentrations are much higher. And then the last thing I want to point out for all of these data sets is that these data are coming from our 3510 site, which is in Gilbert Bay, kind of in the middle of Gilbert Bay. Most recently, we're seeing that deep brine layer at that site really decrease. And so the samples we've collected at shallow and deep, the nutrient concentrations are very similar. It's kind of mixing out, and we're seeing less of a distinctive deep brine layer signal there less recently. And then the other data set we build or collect from this monitoring program is salinity. Again, this is showing data at 3510. I'm sorry, I know many of you have seen this a million times, so I won't belabor it. But you know, this data set allows us to see seasonality. I'll just zoom into the most recent conditions. Our sample from June of this year, we measured salinities of about 163 and 165 at shallow and deep. That does kind of exceed, or it does exceed the threshold that the Salinity Advisory Committee identified for, you know, the optimal range for brine shrimp. And so if we look most recently, we can see during runoff time period this year, we did see a dilution in the salinity concentrations where they kind of dipped below that threshold, and then we've been increasing ever since. And given what Brian has said about lake elevations and what we expect for the rest of this year, we expect continued decline. We would expect these salinity concentrations to continue increasing throughout the rest of this year until we see a bump up again from runoff. Okay, so that kind of concludes our most recent, our recent data for nutrients and salinity. And so now we'll transition into talking about some of the studies that we're working on at USGS in partnership with GSLEP, starting with this nutrient mass balance study that was proposed by Dan Naffs a couple of years ago. So his idea was to update the study he did in 2017, which looked at nitrogen mass in South Arm as compared to nitrogen loads coming from rivers and atmospheric deposition. He did that analysis from 2010 to 2014, and then kind of pitched the idea, well, why don't we extend this? Why don't we look at what's been happening under these new management paradigms with a closed railroad causeway and then a reopening of the new breach? Unfortunately, he was unable to do this before he retired last year. And so this task has kind of shifted to our center in the Utah Water Science Center. We've assembled a team of Hannah McElwain, Molly Bukowski, and myself. And so we're currently working on updating NAP's previous report. So outlining the major objectives, reminding folks of what those are, is to compute nitrogen inflow loads from 2010 to 2021. We're extending it to 2021, which is, we think, the most recent data we can incorporate. We're going to be calculating monthly nitrogen pools in the north and south basins like NAPS did previously. We're going to compare our results to his. And then we're also going to be documenting the impact of the new breach, of that new opening in the causeway, and how that might affect nitrogen redistributions and potential effects on nitrogen cycling. And so I'm going to turn it over to Hannah. She's going to go over some preliminary results from this effort.
Thanks, Christine. So as Christina covered, our partnership with GSLEP collects a lot of data. All of this data is available on USGS's National Water Information System, so it's publicly accessible. We used nutrient and discharge data from 2010 to 2021. Continuous discharge is monitored at most of our inflow sites, with the exceptions being Bear River Ray outflow and the new breach. Because we don't actively collect atmospheric deposition on Great Salt Lake, the National Atmospheric Deposition Program's data was used to calculate that deposition on Great Salt Lake. And as we go through these next few slides, we'll talk about the changing lake conditions and how they've affected some of these preliminary results we've come across. So to build more robust models and to assure that we're replicating Dave's methods and to check our results to his, we're just using all of this data. This plot is of the South Arm resident nitrogen. And as you can see, these top two lines, the light gray and pink, those are upper brine layer and overall Gilbert Bay constant mass for dissolved nitrogen. This goes relatively unchanged, or there's not dramatic changes that we see even as lake conditions change. However, the deep brine layer in both the north and south basins reflect those changes so much. Especially, they're especially influenced by the closing and opening of the railroad causeway. We can see those deep brine layers starting to drop off in 2012 and 2013 as the culverts are closed. And in that time where there was no flow between the north and south arms except for at Lakeside, we can see that those deep brine layers disappear completely in the south arm. As we opened the new breach in December of 16, those deep brine layers recover mid-2017 and continue on until our most recent time when lake levels are declining. That south arm deep, or that south basin deep brine layer is declining so dramatically, and a little less so for the north basins layer. As we continue on with this work, new data sets are being compiled to help us more accurately calculate the volumes of the upper and deep brine layers. And as those are completed, we'll refine our methods and incorporate more constituents, including ammonia, in this study. We can go ahead. For the inflow outflow, dissolved nitrogen and mean daily discharge were used to model this plot. And those results are pretty close to what Dave saw in his 2017 paper. However, as I continue working on this, some considerations we want to take into account are Bear River Bay outflow. Like Ryan said, that gauge, the nearest gauge, is at Corinne, and working on the best way to estimate daily discharge at Bear River Bay outflow, while accounting for those times where we don't see flow there. the bidirectional flow at the new breach. We all know that this is a complicated system, and because we don't have daily discharge, we're working on ways to model those flows coming in and out of the south arm. And we also see negative discharge measurements at Farmington Bay, Lakeside, and these need to be accounted for. Those can happen during different conditions, especially during wind events. So, and then as you know, lake levels are declining, the uncertainty of whether these inflows are reaching the actual lake are growing. So something else to keep in mind. Go to the next. The atmospheric deposition data was calculated by using this National Atmospheric Deposition data and compiling those in polygons on the lake. Those were used to, those were summed together and give us these loads that we see in Gilbert Bay and Gunnison Bay. We also have values for Farmington Bay and Bear River Bay. And this will be essential in accounting for the sources of inputs for the south arm. This kind of concludes this portion of it. We are continuing to work on this and just really interested to see, especially how the berm affects nutrients in the south arm. We also were tasked with evaluating our Great Salt Lake equation of state as, again, lake levels decrease, densities increase in the south arm, and we wanted to make sure that our current equation could accommodate those higher densities. Starting last summer, 18 samples were collected from the south arm at the breach and at the culverts in the north arm, and were sent to the University of Miami for salinity analysis. We got those results back recently, and our measured salinity compared to our calculated salinity with the equation of state had less than a 5% difference. So we're pretty confident that we can increase that upper density range from 1.145 to 1.2144, and we won't have to rework this equation. And we'll touch in Christine's salt balance, we'll address this more. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
There is one question from the chat that says, how deep was 3510 to the bottom, and do you measure that? And that was from Anne.
We do measure that, and it ranges from our deep measurements are taken 0.5 meters above the bottom. So that depth ranges from 6 to 7 meters.
Actually, I just want to follow up on that question, if you don't mind. So with the deep brine layer, does it dissolve uniformly, or is it like kind of all over the place and then it just starts dissipating? Or do you see it potentially in one place and not in another? Does that make sense?
So yeah, the way that the south arm is situated, there's somewhat of a natural spillway disconnecting the north basin and the south basin. And we do see the deep brine layer dissipating from the south basin more rapidly than the north basin because it's just further away from where that breach is and where that north arm water is coming in.
I seem to remember that last year, when you did the nutrient cycling work, you did some atmospheric deposition testing as well. Have you compared that to the national averages, and does that compare relatively well? Or
Yeah, Molly Bukowski's general atmospheric deposition modeling, and she kind of ran our monitoring of the actual collection of samples. And so she's in a separate publication, she's going to be formally comparing the nutrient deposition rates from collected samples versus this National Atmospheric Deposition Program. So there will be a formal comparison of that. And I believe they did compare pretty well. There's differences, especially spatially when she plots them out. There's some areas from our samples that really kind of pop out that don't show up on the National Atmospheric Deposition Programs network. But, yes, she's evaluated that spatially as well as in terms of the manual load. Thank you.
Any other questions for USGS folks? All right, well,
There's one more, sorry. This is from the chat. It's from Carrie France. I wanted to make folks aware that in the microbialite reefs I've been visiting this summer, most of what is partially exposed is becoming closed, and I'm measuring salinities in excess of, 220 grams per liter. It looks like the microbialites are starting to get hammered by salinity this summer.
And she's talking about in those bays around Antelope Island, we're seeing that too. So in Buffalo Bay, where the river comes in, and then by Ladyfinger Point, in Bridger Bay, the salinities are skyrocketing, and it looks like sandbars are closing off those areas.
I can chime in a little too. So we can't access 3510, which is where that's the data that Christine put up, but we do also measure salinity at our Saltair Lake elevation gauge at Great Salt Lake Marina. And the most recent measurement there was, I think, 176 grams per liter for salinity. And that was in
July 25th.
July 25th. So,
And that's probably closer to open water than what we're seeing in the, but I think those bays are becoming artificially hypersaline and not reflective of Gilbert Bay proper, but still it's concerning because that's what's going to happen in the shallows where the microbialites are. And I do take issue with the biologically active zone only being in the upper water column. FYI. Fair enough. That's a brine shrimp centric.
Brine shrimp, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
I think Carrie takes issue with that too.
Noted.
so you want to be relevant.
I want to be relevant.
All right.
I'm striving for relevance.
Aren't we all?
Girls gotta have goals.
So, any other questions for USGS? All right, well, I'll let Ashley go through the shrimp demographics and then, of course, the prediction. Although, I mean, kind of to the point of what everybody's talking about, we have not been able to get out on the lake for like 2 months. So this is a limited amount of data since July. So
When we were out watching our boat get craned from the marina, I took some pictures to show you guys. So this is where we're supposed to normally put our boat in. Jim could probably talk more about how difficult that would be.
Very difficult.
Possible.
This is the view when you look out from the information boards. So all of those are exposed microbialites that weren't, or I've never seen exposed, and I don't know if anyone has. Nope. And hopefully this works. I took a time-lapse video of the boat being craned out. I was up there taking the time lapse and saw Kyle and Jim helping, and I'm like, oh, guess I should be doing that. I thought it would be a liability, but they let you chain it up and everything. Yeah.
Do you have
It was
one-
pretty
Do you have one
cool.
from when you pulled it from the Antelope Island Marina just to compare?
No, we left before that.
For that, yeah.
Yeah, so the second marina that since I started that we can't go into anymore.
right. Yeah. We'll see if they all get closed down.
So with that being said, our last sample run was June 27th, and we haven't been able to get out since, so that's kind of why our data stops. So temperature was looking, I don't know, sometimes below average, sometimes above average, but pretty average for the lake throughout the year. And I am curious about what July looked like because it was our hottest July in Utah record, and we had, I think, more than 19 days above 100, 22 days. So I'm assuming that red line would be a little bit above the average. We were also really high for salinity, ending in June around 17%. It's probably gone up since then. I know you guys reported 17.1, I think, for the last sample. So hopefully we can get out soon and get a measure of salinity. We started out higher than usual too, and this is actually when we start to increase a little bit. So it'll probably get up to 17.5 maybe. Chlorophyll was a little weird. We started out really low and then it recovered, and now we're kind of seeing the usual pattern just a little bit later where the shrimp eat all the chlorophyll out of the lake. And when you guys flew last week, you said it was clear. So
For the most part, so it looks like they've kept it down.
so there's shrimp out there. Looks like.
Most likely.
We saw our cyst density was pretty high this summer. Our last reading in June was 196 cysts per liter, but the average for that month ended up about 96 cysts per liter. Nauplii kind of goes with the pattern of the rest of the shrimp after they hatched. They were all a little bit late, maybe like a month late for their peak. And we are at about 9.5 nauplii per liter in June.
Ashley, do you think that's a salinity issue or it's not a temperature issue?
Gary's saying yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, first feeling of,
unless lens.
yeah, right, okay.
Yeah, and we don't think we missed the first generation, so. Juvenile density pretty much matched nauplii density. 3.2 juveniles per liter in the lake as an average for June. We did have pretty high adult numbers, and it looks like they reached their peak at around the time that they do. It was just a lot more. So our productivity in the lake was really high actually this year. We had a lot of females with eggs out there, and then we had a lot of females with cysts. And they actually had a lot of cysts per ovisac too. So even though the lake is salty and warm, the productivity was very high this year. So we ended up at about 0.4 females with cysts per liter by the end of June. But I am curious if that was their crash, and we're just going to see that one generation, or if there's been multiple since then. And males were also high at 2.5 males per liter. So that brings our total adult count relatively high, one of the most productive years so far, and then we'll have to get back out and fill in the rest of the data.
Ashley, I want to make sure I understand when you say that their productivity is high in terms of cyst. Does that mean live birth is impacted, is lower?
That was about average as well.
Okay, so we're not seeing any shift. It's where it should be in terms of that ratio of live birth versus encysted embryos.
That's a good question. The amount of nauplii and eggs in the ovisac were pretty average for this year. So I think they're just making more cysts, but
I think so.
We may disagree on this, but I did some back of the envelope calculations. And that peak cyst number that you got at the end of June, biologically, I cannot see how it came out of the production of the shrimp themselves.
You're talking about the cyst count?
The 191 or whatever it was.
That
cyst
was
count.
probably
They're there, but they couldn't have been produced by the shrimp themselves.
Yeah, I don't
Given,
think it would make up for it. The amount of cysts per ovisac would not.
no, it
account for all
doesn't.
of those cysts.
It still comes out twice as much as what they're actually producing. But
So you think they're leftover cysts?
Kyle had a good explanation for me.
We talked about the tidal pools that you guys are measuring high salinities in. I think those are trapping cysts.
Sure.
And then during certain wind events and different rainstorms, whatever, I think those are getting washed back into the lake.
Yeah.
Because that's what we're observing when we're out on the ATVs under these fit. You see these areas with
Loaded
trapped
with
water
cysts, yeah.
that are just loaded with cysts.
Yeah, I think we're gonna see more and more of that.
I agree.
What Kyle pointed out also was that they could be trapped previous produced cysts are trapped in the microbialites.
Yes.
And now when you expose those microbialites and you get wave action and that,
Yeah.
it gets back into the pelagic. But biologically, everything that these demographic numbers have can't lead to that 191 cysts per liter.
Just to play devil's advocate.
I knew you
think
would.
No, but I think there may be some truth in what you're saying. I'm not, but I do think, and maybe Phil, you could talk about it too, but I do remember in our data that when we saw that peak in cysts or cyst count, we also saw a very, very high value of cysts in the brood sacs at that time.
Yeah, the
More than
timing,
we've ever seen in prior years.
Right, well, yeah, but it still wasn't high enough when I calculated things out to account for this, yeah.
it's an interesting bit of timing because it's almost a clone of your data set and general patterns. We have a sampling on July 20th. That was the last we were able to get out before we had to dredge the harbor. And it very similar observation, mid-late June was when the population peak was. We had one of the highest adult densities in our period of record just because the timing landed correctly. So there were high densities and we observed a lot of cyst production, probably some of the highest in our record for a single date. And so there was a lot, but perhaps not enough to generate the spike in cyst densities in the water column, which we also observed were above 150. So it's a real thing, and it does beg that question about the timing of it. That it looks suspicious having it come right after all the cyst production, but if there is substantial reservoir of cysts ringing the lake that it's getting put in, it could just be a coincidence of time or some
I
combination
think
of
it's
the
a
two.
combination of.
Yeah.
We are
Yeah.
seeing really good production right now, which we'll get into prediction. And I think also that artificial flow back in from previous.
And you still see
It's building effect.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna try and pull up the graphs I sent you of our OVASAC data. It is higher, but I don't think it's significantly
No,
higher.
I agree.
Now what?
Don't count on technology.
I thought
No,
that's
it's
what
not
you
working
guys
out.
Ashley for.
What that?
Isn't that what Ashley's for, for technology?
Well, most of the time, they don't let me get within 5 feet.
I think she's aged out though. You might need a younger. Yeah. Yeah.
I agree
You
with-
age out of tech once you're out of your 20s.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see.
That's what I'm thinking too.
So you're saying she's old?
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Well,
Now nothing's working.
if anybody has a teenager that they can lend us, it always might be good.
Is
Hold
there a
on.
way to tell the age of the cysts since you're seeing such a high number? No.
Great question.
Wish we did.
All right,
Got it.
okay, so we entered,
Well, hold on.
Oh,
So,
yep.
just to, talking about the cyst count, the really high cyst count, the potential for a leftover cyst that might have accumulated in the bioherms and so on. In the last couple of years, we've seen some very strange dormancy patterns where we have much less dormancy in the cysts that we sample in the summer, which could be partially explained by these leftover cysts that might accumulate in these pools and bioherms and so on, and are later released into the open water. So there are some indicators there that would support your theory there, I think, Gary.
How do you think, how would you test?
Well, typically we're seeing cysts that are being produced in summer being in a very strong dormancy. They wouldn't hatch, more than 5% or so without manipulating them with chemicals. What we're seeing today is that the cyst, and last year we saw the same pattern, cysts that we're sampling today are hatching at about 50%, fill 50, 60%, and sort of in that range. We've never seen that before, summer cysts.
Yeah.
Only seen it in the last 2 years. And that would support the theory, older cysts would typically not be in a strong dormancy. And so would typically be in a quiescent form and therefore would hatch out. So you could see a mixed population there of older cysts that are quiescent and that are readily hatching, with a newer cysts that are in a strong dormancy that are not readily hatching. And that could be an explanation and supportive of Gary's finding as well. But we're not sure. We've just seen that.
Thomas knows we tried early on in GSLEP to get at what happens to these cysts that leave the water column. And one was we talked about using radioactive labeled cysts to put in the lake, and that didn't fly. Radiation, of course. And then we talked about using resin bead, same density as a cyst, and that you could use with ultraviolet light or something to count them. It was just too expensive to do. So that kind of went away.
The dormancy can be an indicator. It's an indirect indicator, and you're not 100% sure. I mean, there's a possibility that these cysts are being produced partially dormant. We don't know that, but it is a possible explanation. That's John, I was talking to Gary about it. If I think Gary's interested, we're happy to share these couple of data points that we have where you were not able to go out.
Yeah, certainly.
I think that may help with the modeling.
Yeah, we need that.
Sure. Sure.
Okay. Samples from January, 2 from February, and 1 from March. And then the nauplii started to appear in April. So without taking out outliers, our forecast is at about 103 cysts per liter. It kind of falls in between the density independent and density dependent curve for the first time in a while. So we could even see that be higher. And then if you drop outliers, it comes to about 126 cysts per liter. So that is our 2022 harvest forecast.
And you're at 191 already.
Yeah, 195 in June.
I think the key point of where that 195 is, our two endpoints are on the opposite arms. So we have our lower endpoint on the density independent side, and our higher is on the density dependent side. So we're somewhere in the peak. So that can account for that, why we have at least some of the production that we're seeing.
Yep.
Maybe not totally the system numbers that we have. But, so that 125 is probably our lowest guess estimate.
And that's it. Yes.
Actually, can I give an update on the marina?
Sure.
Great Salt Lake State Park Marina. We're working with the Army Corps of State Parks and Water Resources, who has the funding for the marina dredging, but to dredge a channel in the marina and out into the lake, hopefully within the next 2 months. And I think the intention is to get search and rescue boats out, but I would think that wildlife should be able to get out there.
We count as search and rescue.
So,
We qualify.
We're out there.
Awesome.
That's actually really good news. I'm surprised it's moving that fast.
Okay.
It's
well,
working.
if it goes as quick as the breach modification did, we should be done.
That won't happen. That will
Two
much.
quick moving projects in a couple months.
No new
Should be two.
Yeah.
Well done.
Things have been moving so far. But where to put
She's
the
muted.
dredge material is the biggest issue right now, of course, with the Corps. And putting it where it was placed last time, back in 2017, is not really an option, so.
A quick comment. We're going to probably have to move our Saltair gauge.
Yeah, right.
There's I think we're down to a half a foot, somewhere between a half foot and a foot of water depth where our gauge is located. So, and it's a down-looking radar, so it measures the water surface elevation that way. And I don't know, we're not exactly sure right now where, there's no other place in the harbor really that will have enough depth. So there's a chance that we switch to a gauge on the south side of the causeway temporarily. So that's just a heads up.
So if you do have to dig down to move your gauge down, you have to dig down the whole lake. Just so just so
Laura,
you know.
can you guys dredge? Yeah, like John said, the whole lake. Yeah. Okay.
But if you dredge it, that doesn't make more water.
I know.
Jamie, Butler is on chat and she's got a question, so she's gonna unmute
Hey,
herself
I
real
know.
quick.
Hi, everybody. I know this is very brine shrimp centric meeting, but what are you seeing with the fly larvae in the lake?
Oh,
Jen,
I
I wish we could say something,
Yeah.
but we haven't really been out sampling, so I couldn't.
We were getting a lot in the spring. And we're hypothesizing that those came from marginally exposed microbialites and wave action that were knocking those off into the water column. But since then, we haven't been active.
Last week, it was devastating. The north tip of Antelope Island, I hiked out into the water up to my thighs. Never saw any brine flies. The brine fly pupa, not pupal casings, but actual pupa were dead all over the beach. No flies. The gulls were out in the water. Phalaropes were out in the water. Not, there were no birds eating flies on the shore. There were no flies. That bay was at 19% that day. So I think in those shallows, it's not good.
Hey, it's Danielle from GSLEP. I've actually been playing with our brine fly numbers because we look at brine fly larvae at every site. And it is higher than normal. I don't know if it's significant yet. I haven't ran the statistics on it. But yeah, at every site, especially the ones that are neighboring microbialites, Jim's correct that there are more larvae than normal in the water column itself.
Are they living?
Yeah, they're free floating though. I don't think that's good for
So,
them.
right.
Well, the larvae are free floating. That makes sense. But the pupa, are you saying pupa or larva?
Larva.
The little caterpillars are.
Yeah, we count
Yeah.
the larvae in when we sample every site.
And so I think that's actually a bad sign because they should be attached to those microbialites. And what Jim was saying is because they're closer to the surface now or completely exposed, they're getting washed off.
And they can't adhere and pupate.
Right. And,
Okay.
and so.
Yeah, so we're seeing an increase in the water
Typically, they
column.
can move on those microbialites and not be washed away, and that's what's happening. So anecdotally, I've had multiple people tell me, I visited this area out on the lake, and where are all the flies?
Yep.
Which is weird
It's very weird.
because usually it's, why are all these flies here and how do I avoid it? And they're obviously not going to bite them, but they're just, that's been a strange observation this year.
I was at the same site 3 weeks prior, loads of flies. Last week, 0 flies around my ankles.
We observed a lot in our net hauls too. We don't enumerate them, but it was suspiciously high early in the summer, the amount of incidental catch of larvae we were getting at sites in the middle of the lake. So
yeah,
just suggest abandoning ship.
Yeah.
We had no way of knowing why they were there, but it was enough to catch our attention.
And we were waiting for the hatch in the spring, and there was more larvae than shrimp. And
Wow.
there should have been more shrimp.
Carrie France also just has another piece of input, and then after that, Ann Novella has a question. Carrie says, we've been counting them around the microbialites at Buffalo Point, and they looked pretty normal so far where I've been. for me, they've been counting both pupa and larvae. And then Ann has a question.
Well, this is a way changing topic. I just wondered if we were ready for some good news. And it's not necessarily about Great Salt Lake.
Anne's gonna hang up if somebody doesn't get it.
So, Jamie Barnes, my government relations person, just said that Jamie Barnes announced that the Utah Lake restoration was not constitutional.
The application.
Right. So we don't know what. Right. That's my understanding. But so that's one good news, at least a little bit. Not necessarily for Great Salt Lake, but maybe maybe a little bit more from Utah Lake. I had to throw something good in.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the other thing I would say about brine flies is back when, so Josh did his study on goldeneye out in on the lake and found that there were it's the highest wintering population or inland wintering population of common goldeneye at that time. Now, continued to do those surveys since Josh left, just as a matter of trying to determine if there's a trend there. And the goldeneye have dropped off significantly since 2003 or 4. I think it was between 2003 and something he was here. And that we've seen that goldeneye, which are feeding on the brine fly larvae, and those numbers have precipitously gone down over time. So it's starting to, yeah, and they dive down and are able to pick those off the microbialites. And now we're just not seeing the number of goldeneye. Jim's been able to see that from the lake. We've been able to see it from the air, that you're just not getting the same numbers of goldeneye as we used to get, which was 45,000 in February. Now I don't even think we're above 10,000. So it's.
So a 75% drop.
Yeah, somewhere like that. So, and you knew there was going to be impacts to birds with the lake getting lower, but is it, how do you measure birds when, one thing with goldeneye, at that point in time, all the freshwater impoundments are frozen, so there's none there, so you're strictly counting what's on the pelagic portions of the lake, and that's where they were pretty common in certain areas because they concentrated around those microbialite fields. Now they're all exposed or just barely in the water, and you're just not seeing the numbers of goldeneye, which is just one species of bird, but it's an easier one to track because of the timing of it, which is dead of winter, and where they're concentrated. And some of the other spots were the outflows of Farmington Bay and where Bear River comes in, because they had to come get fresh water to drink at a certain time. You just don't see them like they were. That's one species of bird that's a little easier, whereas the other ones that we do the surveys on, we can't cover the whole lake. So they may be moving from place to place, and we aren't able to track that because the habitats changed or the water depths changed or the amount of forage has changed.
So just based on your method, that's
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think those northern shovelers were doing last year where they were all congregating on top of each other?
So that also, Tony Roberts looked at green-winged teal and shovelers feeding on the pelagic portions of the lake, and they're feeding on both cis and brine shrimp out there, streaks. So And so I think that the value of cysts is not very good, and a lot of them were just passing through. So we actually saw shovelers that were starving to death. Now they're filling up, but they were starving to death, and we've had that happen a couple different years. We had it happen this year. And then it was like 5 years ago, they reported them in Antelope Island Marina. We actually tried to go catch some of them, but we're slugging through the mud. So we weren't able to, the birds would be basically emaciated. So we sent them in for testing because, well, maybe it's a disease. There was no disease associated with it. It was just that they were starving to death. But that was the only food source that they had. And they're filling up on them. They're basically.
They're eating too many cysts, you're saying, and the cysts aren't as nutritious.
Exactly. Yeah. And so they're just passing them through and not getting any value or nutrient value out of them. But that's the only thing that they had to consume. So anyway.
I think Jamie raised her hand.
I was just going to ask if have you like seen anything anecdotally with the phalaropes? I know, John flies a lot. Have you seen anything with them?
So I don't know. Neil probably has the numbers on that, but at least I would say from 2 or 3 years ago when we first started doing the phalarope survey, we were in the hundreds of thousands then. And I would say we're below 100,000 total on any one of the surveys that we've done this year.
They're lower. Yeah, I think our peak number in the end of July, that's when you usually have the peak dollar numbers, is I think 325,000 was our peak a couple of years ago. And this year it was 168,000, I believe.
That's a lot, or that's better than what I thought it was just looking at it, but.
Does that survey cover the W maze, or is that just the lake?
Everything.
It covers, I travel perimeter of the lake, and then we go into the duck clubs, WMAs, Bear River Refuge. Most of the phalaropes are out in Carrington Bay typically, and in Farmington Bay. They seem to be spread out more this year compared to previous years. They tend to be all along Stanbury Island, which we haven't seen before. And part of that's probably the change in lake levels and the habitat exposing the microbialites. They tend to be focused on microbialites when they're here on the west side. And lately they haven't been clumped. We usually get huge flocks of staging phalaropes, like 100,000, and we haven't seen flocks like that. So that part of our survey protocol, it's easier to identify huge flocks than smaller spread out flocks. So flocks that may be out in the open water pelagic areas of the Great Salt Lake are not as visible.
Which is also, that was another one of Mike's students was Maureen, was doing the phalarope work. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that as far as, the difference in foraging on like the pelagic portions as opposed to like Farmington Bay and Ogden Bay, which used to be, at least when Maureen started, Ogden Bay was an important area, and now it's just dirt. So there's no birds that are using that area. So
Yeah, and Farmington Bay used to be important.
it is still, we're seeing birds in there, but it's limited to the tiny little section that there is water there.
Shout out to a brand new data set that we'll be collecting for the next 3 years, a snapshot migratory shorebird survey, which includes phalaropes every spring and fall.
True.
That doesn't include all that in W9.
I'll give a better snapshot of phalaropes all around.
Yep, every spot in the lake.
Right.
tell us
Yeah.
more about Great Salt Lake.
Hopefully that'll tell us what the population overall is doing and whether it would have been nice to have that 10 years ago or 10 years ago data when I think there was probably higher numbers or at least a few years ago even, but at Great Salt Lake anyway.
Ann Neville raised her hand.
Yeah, I was just gonna say from those bird counts that we did last week, a lot more phalarope than I had been used to seeing on the ponds in this fall than before. It seems like the especially the rednecked almost hardly ever came into the ponds, and now they're mixed in with the Wilsons pretty heavily.
Gilmore and ISSR.
Ah.
I could hardly hear, so.
Okay, I think that's all the questions, so I'll pull up Gary's presentation.
Well, to start out, I want to be sure that Ashley changes the name of my talk
Yeah.
from what she copied off my flash drive. It was titled Final Tag because that was my final draft. I'm not making a statement about what's going on. Okay, a lot to cover here. Oh, it's not working.
Do I have? It's in there.
The program formerly known as Great
Yeah.
Salt Lake Ecosystem.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
Not yet. Easy.
No.
We're staying in there.
well,
How many years to retirement, Jim?
that's
Hold on.
You're fine.
working for you.
Yep. Now it's not even working for me.
It's not working. You'll have
All
to
right,
change
if I can get
the
it to work. Okay.
Okay, next slide.
I have a remote if you think the battery's fine.
No, batteries are good on it. The end of June, with the last GSLEP sampling of the lake, the good news is there's no big changes we can see in phytoplankton in the lake. So it looks good for the brine shrimp. You can see here that the blue line is the data from this year and the red is for the previous 5 years. And you can see that chlorophyll, amount of phytoplankton in the lake, looks about the same. If we look at the composition of the phytoplankton, it's through the chlorophytes, the green, bacillariophytes, the diatoms, and the cyanophytes, we can see that there's no big changes there as well. So, and then in total for the year up to this point, we're looking on track for previous year. So we're not seeing any shifts yet with the salinity changes in the lake in terms of anything to do with the phytoplankton in the lake. Next. Okay, the other thing that's been provided to the GSLEP group is a first prototype model of the Great Salt Lake pelagic zone. Everything's been turned over to them. And I wrote a 56-page user's manual. And that user's manual not only tells you how to run the programs, and there's 2 programs, a single year projection and a 5-year forecast into the future. Not only tells you how to run each of those programs, but they also have now the complete model structure for the pelagic, equation by equation in the model. So that's almost line by line in the model, not counting some of the timekeeping functions and things like that. Also, it provides to them the model verification and validation, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And it also provides to them how to do a post-2021 5-year forecast for the lake, what you have to do to run that, set it up. So everything for the pelagic side, and it's not a final model, things will change, But this model has been turned over to GSLEP so they can play with it. Next. Okay, there's two types of model validation. One is the single year projection, and that's the projections that I've been talking about to this group for about a year now, and I presented to the Friends of the Great Salt Lake in May. That model, you take and use the observed monthly salinity, the observed monthly lake temperature, the maximum nitrogen measured in the pelagic, upper pelagic zone, and it then predicts what are the pelagic responses, phytoplankton, brine shrimp, and bird responses to this, grebe responses in particular. The 5-year forecast model, which is the one that lets you project things into the future, that is a more complicated model in some respects, but the actual data is simpler because you don't know what those values are going to be each year after from the current state. And so the inputs on those are each year you have to project an annual inflow of water to the lake and an average air temperature. And on those two values, it projects what's going to happen each year. Then the next year you get an input and inflow in, an average air temperature, and it projects what's going to happen. So the model in effect is more complicated, but the data that you have, given that you're trying to forecast something, totally unknown, the data that you have to make that forecast is much more restricted. So this is what I've shown in past TAG meetings, the last TAG meeting in March, and at the Friends of the Great Salt Lake meeting. Here's the projection for 2015 to 2020 to validate the model. And the red bars are the observed values. The blue bars are the predicted values from the model. And this is for the single year forecast or projection model. And you can see that it does very well for chlorophyll, does very well for cysts, does well for nauplii, does well for juveniles, and does fairly well for adults, although there is some discrepancy in the latter months of the summer. Now, the R values here are very high. If we go to next slide, we can measure this in various ways. That was measured by taking the average conditions in the lake for that 5 years, the average of the parameter of concern for that 5-year period, say CIS, what was the 5-year average, and then projected what that average should be. If you do it year by year, you get a lower R value for each of the parameters. And if you do it by all the months combined over that 5-year period, you get a slightly higher value, but still not as high as averaging over the 5-year period in terms of the parameter values that you're putting in and trying to test. So this gives you an idea that it's going to range somewhere between an R of 0.82 to 0.89 for cysts, an R of 0.77 to 0.96 for nauplii, ranges from a juveniles 0.71 to 0.96, adults 0.86 to 0.89, and chlorophyll 0.79 to 0.98. What this points out is that we have insufficient sampling. Each year that you're measuring these parameters, there's too much variability there. So when you average over 5 years, you are getting a better picture of what's going on in the lake. Okay. So the upper value here is the one that I showed you in the previous set of bar charts. And this tells you at a finer scale how good you're doing. And what this is telling you is that going out twice a month sampling the lake, there's too much noise. We've known that for years. I remember 20 years ago when we were discussing how much sampling needed to be done, it was a compromise because we knew that it wasn't going to be enough. Just logistically couldn't do more. Right, Phil? You were around for that.
Yeah, it's still true.
Still true, yeah. Okay, so this is the yearly model. Does good. Let's go to the 5-year projection model. Next slide. Oh, there it is. It projects the maximum volume of the lake. You can see here, the blue again is predicted, the red is observed. Not too bad. Predicts minimum salinity, the month of that has the minimum salinity of the lake. Doesn't do too bad. Doesn't do too bad for the maximum nitrogen content. It predicts what month that the hatch is going to take place in, what week of the year that the hatch is going to take place in. Based upon temperature and salinity, it doesn't do so as well on when the hatch takes place. But it's still not far off. It's still predicting that we should be seeing later hatching now as the salinity goes up, which is what we're observing. If we look at the phytoplankton, the chlorophyll values, the R value is 0.89. Cis value is predicted to be 0.90. Nauplii values 0.87. And you can see the nauplii are much more, the observed is much more variable and higher than predicted by the model for a 5-year period. And the same thing is true for adults. So we would expect a 5-year projection not to be as good as a year-by-year projection. Because now we're putting in how much water is flowing into the lake, what is the average air temperature, that gets converted to water temperature. We're making all these projections now, even though it may be going up and down temperature and salinity at different points in the year. And in fact, what you're saying here is that the same month in the 5-year projection is always going to have the minimum salinity. Let's say June. But in reality, it may be May. It may be July. I can't make a model that gives such little information and then projects things on a monthly by month fine scale. But overall, it's telling you the general expectations of what you expect to see in the lake. Next slide. And as expected, say for phytoplankton, averages of all month, let's go down to this line here. The single year projection was 0.98, an R value 0.98. It drops to 0.89 over the 5-year projections. Goes for cis from 0.89 to 0.9. So essentially the same for cis production. Goes down to 0.87 from 0.96 for nauplii, and goes down, that says about the same for adults. So it does pretty much the same, but slightly worse on a 5-year projection than you do on the single-year projection. You expect it to do worse, because you're compounding error, don't forget, as well. So in 1 year, you're off on salinity a little bit. That carries over to the next year. Whereas in the single year projection, you're actually putting in what the salinity is. So what this model can do with a 5-year projection is it's not going to give you a good solid projection of how many shrimp are going to be out there or how many cysts are going to be out there, but it's going to tell you, are things going to get better or are they going to get worse? Are they going to get better by a little bit, by a lot, or worse by a little bit or a lot?
So Gary, just remind us the data that you used to build the model, was that through 2014 or through 2010?
The model, the data to build the model is all based on laboratory experiments.
Oh, it's all lab.
It's all lab controlled experiments.
It's not bad. Those correlations are not bad at all.
No. I'm not trying, what I'm trying to say here though is I don't want anyone to say, oh, we're at 2 adults per liter in July predicted by the model, but we're only seeing 1.3. That's not going to be the case. But if you look at the whole pattern over years and between years, it's going to give you a picture of what you can expect that you should be able to count on. Next slide. Okay. Some surprises arose in finishing up the 5-year projection model before sending it in. First thing that arose was that I had to build into it, is the berm going to be raised or is the berm going to be kept where it is, okay? So there is a choice on the 5-year model now to say, have you raised the berm or are you letting just free exchange between the north and the south arm? That's another question that asked, and you can, change that. But the worst of what?
Sorry, can you change by how many feet the berm is modified?
Not at this stage. It's yes or no. Okay. It's a 0 or a 1. Better data, yes, that could be built in. Okay. But those changes to put in, is the berm raised or not? The question is, do you have free exchange between the two arms or don't you have free exchange? That's all that's built in there. And don't forget that was built before the berm was even changed and we saw what was going to happen. Okay.
So when you say, yes, the berm has changed, what you mean is that you've cut off the north arm from the south arm and all your inflows are going into the south arm.
Right.
And staying there.
Right.
Okay.
That's what's going on. Real simple. Sorry, I can't make it
not
more
a bad
complicated. Well, that's where we're at. Okay, but there was a bigger shock that came through in trying to not wrap up, but at least get a prototype of the 5-year model to work. Previously, that 5-year model, we had a hydrology's built, has to be built into this. And what I had previously done and talked about years ago when I first did this was that I found one site on the Bear River watershed, one site on the Weber watershed, and the Jordan watershed that predicted how much precipitation did you have that affected the flow going into the Great Salt Lake from each of those sources. And it worked really well. Next slide. And this was the slide for a tag meeting that I built 2-3 years ago when I presented this. And what's in the gold or the tan over here was what I built in based on 1994 to 2006 data. So for the Bear River discharge, the best predictor was the weather station at Bern, Idaho, using the water year data there from precipitation, and then predicting what the discharge was. And look at an R of 0.95 over 12 years. And that required that you knew the current year, 1 year ago, and 2 years ago to be able to predict what the discharge was. If you go to the Weber, Echo Lake weather station was the best for Weber. R of 0.97, 13 years there, and you needed the current year and 1 year previously. Jordan River peak discharge was affected by Utah lake level changes, and that had an R of 0.71. Let's look at 2007 to 2021. The R value for the Bear River dropped from 0.95 to 0.71. The Weber River's R dropped from 0.97 to 0.77. The Jordan dropped from 0.71 to 0.14. And when I say it dropped that R, it meant less water was being discharged than what you had previously expected by water year precipitation. So rain is not getting to the lake. A, it's either being used before it gets to the lake, or B, it's evaporating faster than it used to be? And I can't answer that with this data. I would guess it's being used. The Jordan is surprising. And just as an aside, the other night there's a new television miniseries on Peacock, NBC's subscribed, on Lives of the Mountain Men. And they had an episode on Jedediah Smith coming to the Jordan River in 1826. And in his journal, he says it flows and reminds him of northern Montana rivers. Not any longer. The water's not getting there. But on the same hand, the relationship between discharge of the Bear, Weber, and Jordan into the lake affecting change in lake levels is exactly the same virtually. So what's coming in is working the same way to affect the lake. But what's happening now is that it's not coming in any longer. So that all had to be rewritten. This rainfall effect had to be taken out of the model, and we had to do the model with Bear, Weber, and Jordan inflows, actual inflows. So that was a shock. Maybe it's not a shock, but it made the model have to change. Okay, next. And this is the slide for Thomas. What is the effect of the higher salinities we're seeing right now on the brine shrimp? And will the model have to be changed to account for that? First of all, John knows, I pointed this out to him. He asked me what would happen if the salinity goes to 18%, 180 ppt. And I ran the model at that level. And within 2 years, things really crash.
2 years.
What?
2 years.
2 years. Now, this is just the pelagic zone. As the benthic zone is not, the model's not good enough yet at the benthic level to be included. It will be.
Yeah, I'm just kind of 2 years is like a harsh number.
Well, let's look at what the laboratory experiments show us. Okay, let's look at survival of the 3 life stages. Adults, juveniles, nauplii. Red is adults. You can see they do the best at 90 ppt. Then they start falling off. Juveniles just keep going down in survivorship from 45 all the way to 120, and the nauplii do the best at 90 ppt. Now, the lines here are what the model is built upon for survival versus salinity. So we have now added 150 and now 180. So we've gone 30 ppt higher at each step now. We look at, here's what the model equations show juveniles doing transitioning to the adult stage, is the blue line here. They do better at higher salinity for some reason. Nauplii do the same for survival. They transition better at 90. And you can see at reproduction, cysts and eggs produced per female, that they do best at 90 and it falls off. Okay, at 150, next. Okay, if we just take the projection for nauplii, the line, and extend it out, you can see this is what they're doing at 150, the green bar. This is what they're doing at 180, the green bar. Basically, what the model is doing for nauplii is the same as what we experimentally are getting. For juveniles, they at 150 did better than at 120, and I can't explain that. We've got to run now the 180 with juveniles. We don't have that yet. Adults did a little better at 150 than we would have projected, but it's still way down there for survival. We don't have adults done at 180 yet. If we go to transitioning, you can see that, hit the next slide. You can see nauplii are pretty much right on what we'd expect as we increase salinity to 150 to 200 to 180. The juveniles continue to increase in their transitioning proportion as salinity goes up. I can't explain that. I don't know why. And if we look at adult reproduction, next slide. Take that line down. At 150, they're almost to zero already. So it's actually steeper fall off than the model predicts. But the general pattern from the initial data, the solid lines here that the model is based upon, carries over pretty much as we increase salinity. And they don't do well, other than for some reason, this transitioning for juveniles. Next. Okay, the last set of experiments that we've been going on, I can show some real progress now in looking at decomposition of various elements in the ecosystem. First of all, next slide, this will be added to the model as well to get detailed dynamics of the nitrogen available in the water column. First is phytoplankton decomposition. We have completed these experiments at 3 temperatures, 10, 20, and 30 centigrade. 3 salinities, 80, 120, and 160 ppt. To get this to work, not to bore you with this, but this was a pain to get it to work, because what we did is we kill off the phytoplankton in an autoclave. We weigh it out and we put it into a tube with lake water. So the bacteria come in with the lake water. Well, we ran into a serious problem because as the phytoplankton decompose, the bacteria numbers increase, and if you filter it out and then weigh it, you see no change because the bacteria are increasing the weight, even though the phytoplankton are disappearing. So had to go to the literature. This is a problem. The literature's a mess on this stuff. And you got the same problem if you try to just look at the nitrogen being released to the water, because the bacteria are picking up the nitrogen as well. So I did find finally a paper that said, you know, there's an internal marker within the phytoplankton you can use, chlorophyll. Track the chlorophyll disappearance over time, and that's what this is. And it's easy to do. You just take your tube, throw it into a fluorometer, and you read it. And you can see that the chlorophyll disappears over time and gets down to about 10%, 20 to less than 10% in about 14 days. Well, the model is built upon weekly intervals, which tells us we only have to keep track of the dead phytoplankton for about a 2-week period in the model. That's easy to do. Next slide. Well, the next one was dead brine shrimp. Well, the dead brine shrimp posed a bit of a problem because there's no chlorophyll to measure in the dead brine shrimp. There's no marker per se. And you can see early on, you got 125 to 150% the weight. That's because the bacteria are building up on them. But over time, it goes down. The weight of the carcasses of these brine shrimp. And it gets you to about 10% of mass of the brine shrimp remaining at roughly 23 to 30 days. And that would be a period of, 3 to 5 weeks that you'd have to keep track in the model of the bodies of the brine shrimp. Now, we've done this now at 3 temperatures, 10, 20, and 30, and this was done at 120 ppt. So the next step is to do this at all of the ranges of ppt, 80 and 160. Now, the last slide is one that is our biggest headache. How fast does the brine shrimp fecal pellets, or as we call it, the brine shrimp poop, how fast does it break down? That's what you're dealing with. 600 by 125 microns. You look, it's twisted, it's spun. And in there is either digested or undigested phytoplankton largely. Trying to weigh these things, we couldn't do. To measure mass changes over time. So we came up with the idea of let's use chlorophyll as the marker. Since they're eating chlorophyll, we could look at the disappearance of chlorophyll to try to get down the decomposition of these. Well, let's start out here as the first experiment, and 90% are decomposed, 10% remaining in approximately 36 weeks. Can't believe it takes that long to break down a fecal pellet. But what you can see here is that you've got all of the consumed phytoplankton inside a sheath that's kind of a gelatin sheath. And that sheath is not probably preventing rapid decomposition. So we said, what goes on in the lake that doesn't go on when we just put them in a tube in the laboratory? There's wave action, moving back and forth. There's agitation. So we put the pellets, the same type of experiment, we put them on a shaker table and we didn't violently shake it, but did a little bit of vibration on it. And over time, we could get it to decompose 90% in 14 weeks. So what this is telling us is that one of the biggest things, taking nitrogen out of the water and not getting it back into the water quickly, recycling it quickly, is the fecal pellets of the brine shrimp. The stuff you're picking up in your sediment traps. Okay.
Does it matter if it's warmer, like different
Well,
temperature?
to get to this stage, this is where we're at right now. This would have been 20 degrees C.
Okay.
We haven't done that yet. Okay. And this is at 1 salinity.
Okay.
Right? This is ongoing now. We're still trying to perfect this. But what this is telling us, since this is so slow, how quickly do these pellets fall through the water? Because if they get down into the deep brine layer, down to the bottom, they're not going to be releasing the nutrients back into the water as quickly. How much of this does the brine shrimp produce? So obviously what we've got to do now is do feeding experiments and measure how many pellets are being produced by how much is being consumed by the shrimp. We need to take a column and put some pellets on the top at different salinities and see how fast it settles out. Fortunately, we have an undergrad that's doing a research project, and he doesn't know yet that this is what's going to be done, but it will be done. But that's where we're at decomposition. The next one is ground up feathers. How fast do the feathers decompose? And the one we're dreading most is if we take fresh chicken meat and throw it into the water, how quickly does it decompose?
Oh,
And we don't want that in the lab, but that's where we're at on the decomposition side of things. But dead phytoplankton is going to be no problem in having to deal with in the model. Dead shrimp bodies, a little bit of a problem, but not bad. It's the pellets produced by the brine shrimp that's our biggest problem. To get at the decomposition. Who would have thought that one? I would have thought that the pellets broke down quickly. They don't.
Sounds like a bunch of crap.
It does.
In the absence of robust photosynthesis, they also will not be precipitating calcium carbonate.
What will?
These that seed the ooids.
Yeah.
You don't change the pH, you don't precipitate the calcium carbonate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably what takes part of them out of the water, right?
Could. We're using a single P, well, we're not, we're holding
You're not
pH.
looking at those timescales. So
Right.
Yeah.
That's a much longer time scale than what we're working at. Tom?
In order to stay ahead of the curve, are we going to move to 210 PPTs?
You know, I'm going to say to you, I don't think it's necessary, because I think if we go back, those lines are so steep going down, there's no sense to going to 210.
At this rate, retirement's going to be decided for us.
You and me and Jim are going out for beers. We'll talk about this.
Gonna leave.
Yeah,
us.
I don't think it's
Us
worth
with
it.
Let's see what these other numbers give us at 180. I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
Given what we've got at 150, other than for juvenile transitioning, it's bleak. 180 for the nauplii is even bleaker. So we're talking about nauplii chance of surviving. So surviving means you're still alive after 4 weeks, or you've transitioned to be a juvenile. That's about rough, a round number, about 5% only.
I hate to inject microbiology into your conversations, Gary. But decomposition is done by microbes.
That's why we use lake water.
And increasing, as you know, and increasing salinity, obviously, all metabolic activities, all rates in biochemistry go down when there's more salt and less water in the biological system. So I think what you're seeing absolutely is it's got to be happening in the lake.
Yeah, one of the
We will
things.
not see turnover at the level we would. At a
Yeah,
lower
one of the things though is we're getting lower decomposition at 80
right.
than at 120. Okay? Yeah, 120. And then at 160, it goes down again. So the microbes, to a certain extent, are adapted to a certain higher salinity.
You could be looking at two separate populations. I mean, if those numbers are real, you're looking at two separate populations of degraders, some of which have, you know, are coming from hypersaline places where they've been working, like deep brine layer from the North Arm, and others that are have been working at the lower salinity. So that you would have two pockets of many genera who are working. In that
Shouldn't you though?
Yeah.
Given how long these experiments are running now and how quickly microbes reproduce, see a shift then over time.
Yeah.
And our goal is eventually to characterize these things with molecular techniques just to see if we're seeing shifts
who's there.
in the molecular composition.
That makes sense, but also you could have a region of salinity, like there seems to be a gap in microbiology where these types of organisms at this moderate salinity have these mechanisms to deal with salinity. These types of organisms have really different genetic capacities to deal with that high salinity. And so there might be a gap in the middle where you don't have as many degraders. And that's what your data are pointing to for me, if I were to take a microbiology lens to that.
Okay.
But the way that you're doing this, Gary, are you taking lake water, or you're diluting it to different salinities in order to test that? Because you're taking a microbial population that's being produced at a higher salinity and then diluting it and making it work at a lower salinity. Is that going to have an effect?
It's just going to shift the population to
That
the folks
quickly?
who are
Yeah.
happy. Who are happy every 20 minutes.
every 20 minutes.
That quickly.
You want to see evolution, look at a
Yeah.
micro.
I'm dealing
That's
in
what
a model
our
with trying to
fast.
get these numbers to work on a weekly basis, and we've got 20-minute basis here.
What are the predictions included in the weather for forecasting of outflows?
It is what you said for the 5-year model. It is what you think the outflow will be. Okay?
Mhm.
On the yearly model, it is the actual salinity for each month. But for the 5-year forecast model, it's okay. How much water do you think the Bear is going to provide? How much do you think the Weaver is going to provide? How much do you think is coming down the Jordan?
Other than inflow to the lake and temperature, what are the other input data for the model?
It depends, again, as I said, whether you're looking at the
Either.
yearly model or the 5-year model. The yearly model has monthly salinity, monthly water temperature. It has monthly light intensity. It has what month is the hatching taking place in? You actually put that in.
Cool.
When you go to the 5-year model, you don't know any of those things for any of the projections. You just know what happened last year.
Okay.
You're putting last year's data in and saying, okay, if this is the inflow values for the Bear, the Jordan, and the Weaver, if this is the average air temperature I expect for this next year, what's going to happen to the shrimp and phytoplankton and grebes? Then next year, with that prediction, you then say, what are the inflow values? What are the air temperatures? What are the, and then makes another projection. Of course, in there is the north and south arm connected or not too.
I think that's all the questions I saw.
Gonna point out, grebe carcasses, dead grebe carcasses take forever.
They're pickled.
So,
Right, they're pickled.
so speaking of grebes, I remember Dr. Conover giving a talk, like 95% of the population of the western geared grebe now molts at Great Salt Lake. Is that still true?
They spend the fall here, they stage here,
Yeah, so they land here and they're feeding on, is it just brine shrimp? What else do they?
pretty much brine shrimp.
And is it 95% of the population?
It varies. It used to be there was quite a bit at Mono Lake, and they're still there late summer, early September, but then they all leave Mono Lake. And so if you're looking at when the grebes are on the Great Salt Lake, it's 95%.
So what does that mean if the population of brine shrimp crashes? I mean, that's kind of the take home, right? On
That's what the model predicts for the 5-year forecast model. What's going to happen if things get real bad to the grebes?
And there's usually a 1-year lag
Right.
with how it impacts.
Right.
the
There's
birds.
1-year lags in all these things.
And the other caveat is once the grebes are here, they cannot fly. So they're stuck. And if they could fly, there's no other hypersaline lake in North America that could sustain them all. So it's could be a dark future.
And they're molting here. And that's why we want to do feather decomposition.
Layla, do you have another question?
I just wanted to see, other than salinity, is there other nutrients as input to the model or not?
Oh, yeah, the model is built in such a way that it's assumed there is a nitrogen pool in the lake. And at least in the short term, that nitrogen pool is a constant and it is diluted with the changing volume of the lake, which is the inflow.
So like a nutrient balance kind of a thing.
Right, right. There's a nutrient balance here. Now that's going to change. The way that it's built into the model will change when we understand decomposition and the cycling of nitrogen better, because then we can ask the question, how much nitrogen is available each month? The model is based right now on what is the peak concentration of nitrogen. And with the decomposition built into the model, we can ask, okay, this is the peak, but how much of that is now has been taken up by different sources and then released by the decomposition on a month-by-month basis.
Thank you.
Gary, why is there a year lag?
Because the grebe numbers are dependent on the shrimp numbers in the previous year as well. So the numbers coming in are a function of the previous year.
Okay.
That's the year lag there. Anything else? Not? Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Gary.
Can I push the don't like button?
The what?
Don't like it.
You don't like what? The predictions?
Yeah.
I don't either.
Thumbs down. Thumbs down.
I don't like the predictions either. I want, but it's not going to be.
All right.
In this world of false facts, let me say that if you'll hire me to do Gary's work, the results will be much more positive.
Or as I've been telling friends lately, I never thought I'd be working on an ecosystem that's disappearing.
I just think they should give a warning label that we need to take antidepressants when we're coming to a town.
But it won't disappear if you hire me.
Yeah, don't worry.
Okay, so we'll conclude, but first I wanted to set the